Nowadays, I don't know what I want to say. There's something which is in every time and place. The role of the philosopher. The subject is goes back to about 500 BC at least, and 2,500 years is a long time, and obviously it's evolved. But something seemed to me to be constant. I think that philosophy is, from Socrates on, has been concerned with thinking carefully about how to live. Now, it's been concerned with a lot of other stuff too already. Plato began to be fascinated in philosophy of mathematics, which apparently he took 10 years off at one time to learn the new geometry, which had a big influence on all his thought, theory of knowledge, metaphysics, and so on. But I think that while philosophy can't be exclusively about how to live, it can't be just narrowed to, say, ethics. That combination of an interest in how to live and an interest in reasoning carefully about it, bringing together these two things that seem so different, close reasoning and a concern with man's place in the universe, the meaning of it all, how to live. This has to remain part of philosophy. I think if I have a worry about philosophy today, is that in some quarters at least I sent in Anglo-American philosophy, which has some wonderful accomplishments, but there's a tendency to think that that's sort of optional, that philosophy can become just something like a science. And I think that's an illusion and a fatal illusion. It stops being philosophy when it loses that ethical concern, which I think started it off in some way. I think what we call the mind is really a fairly late construction. In fact, no earlier than Descartes. Of course, there are Greek writings about the mind, but we often forget how very different their list of things that they regarded as part of the mind, what they regarded as central to the mind, what they regarded as peripheral was. For example, for Aristotle, the functions of the psyche, which is the term we usually translate as mind or soul from ancient Greek, include digestion and reproduction. And the psyche, as Aristotle explains in his great work on the soul or on the mind, De Anima, is what he calls the form of the whole organized living animal or human body. That's a very different conception from the conception that we've inherited from the 17th century. It's essentially non-dualist, for one thing. Although the dualist conception is sometimes associated with religion, in fact, the high medievals tended more and more to the Aristotelian view than to the Platonic view. The intellect was not identified with the mind, and the soul was not always identified with the mind. And it was really Descartes who was the first to say intellect, soul, and mind are one and the same thing, and basically created the contemporary concept, ruling out functions like digestion and reproduction as no part of the mind, including memory, which was not clearly part of the mind for all of the ancients and medievals. I think it's useful to know that it's not altogether obvious what's in and what's out of the mind. Though what we're currently counting as definitely in and definitely out represents a particular view which comes in with modernity. One of the things that happened already in Descartes' day, because a number of people found his dualism problematic, is people tended to identify the Cartesian mind with the brain. But on the other hand, the Cartesian mind is entirely conscious. And there's a tension there, because when you actually ask, the kind of thinking we do cannot wholly be explained in conscious terms. Every psychologist, not just Freud, behavior is also, interestingly enough, every serious psychologist found it necessary at some point to postulate a certain amount of unconscious reasoning. Today, among philosophers, John Searle is the only one I know who holds out against the view that a good deal of mental processing isn't conscious. Functionalism is a view that I invented really back in 1960 in in a paper I gave that got included in a book by Sidney Hook called Minds and Machines. And the idea was that there were really two ideas. One, which goes back to Aristotle, which I'm still sympathetic to, is the idea that talk of our minds is not talk of our mind isn't an object, it's a system of abilities. Abilities and processes, that it's to identify abilities and processes with any object like the brain is already to make an error. But the other idea, which I think didn't work, but I think was very well worth trying, came to me because I was one of the early computer scientists, what was called a recursion theorist, which today called a computation theory. And I was teaching computation theory in Princeton in the math department, as well as teaching philosophy. And it occurred to me that maybe what we should say is that a thought or an idea or a disposition, that all of these things are features of our software. In other words, the idea is that the brain is like a computer, and that to talk of the mind is not to talk of the physical properties of the brain. It's to talk of the programs that the brain runs. Being an avid reader of science fiction, I noticed right away that one advantage of that is that you don't have to say, if you run into robots, you don't have to say they aren't really conscious, because they might, after all, be running the same programs as we are, even though they don't have the same software. Whereas if you said that a thought is a particular chemical process, say, or an electrical process in the brain, then if you run into a brain that consists of different chemicals, or that uses something other than electricity, then you'd have to say it didn't have that thought or that feeling. This is an issue that has been played on in Star Wars and Star Trek and in many science fiction novels. So I thought, yes, this is the way to do it, to say that let's look at the brain, or maybe the brain and nervous system, maybe a little more than the brain, as a computer. I use the technical term Turing machine from Alan Turing, the inventor of the computing machine. Say that the brain is a Turing machine, and let us describe its programs in some standard machine language. At that time I used, because real computers were highly inefficient, and no high-powered programming languages existed at that time. So I thought of the formalism that Turing himself invented. But we take a formalism. Today you have machine languages like Java. But then you take a particular formalism in which you could write any program at all. And the idea would be for any idea or thought or mental representation or whatever you like, look for a description of it basically in Java. And that now seems to be science fiction rather than something that really works. I was pushed away from it by considerations coming from philosophy of language and coming from two different directions. One direction had to do with another set of views I was developing at the same time, which turned out to be in deep conflict with this kind of functionalism. These are nowadays referred to as externalist views in philosophy of language, because these are views that say that the meaning of our words and even the meaning of our ideas, our thoughts, deeply it depends on our environment and on society. It was a movement against, from the whole picture, the picture of the mind that Descartes had. I call the traditional picture of the mind sometimes semantic omnipotence, because the picture is that any person has the latent ability to think any thought whatsoever, no matter what his experience. Even if he were a brain in a vat, even if he had a very impoverished experience, as long as he wasn't actually mentally defective, he could in principle refer to anything. And I've been led by a number of considerations, the idea, no, that what you can refer to depends very much on what your environment provides you with, and also on, you rely a great deal on what other speakers are in contact with. For example, I know that this is gold, but if you put aside, and I don't even know, by the way, the atomic weight of gold, if I'm sure I did it sometime, but if you say, oh, so you mean it's a particular element? Yeah, so which element? Well, I couldn't say atomic weight so-and-so, and it passed a certain test. Which tests? Well, Locke says it's soluble in aqua regia, but everyone I've asked what aqua regia is gives me a different answer. One person said it's a weak solution of nitric acid, and somebody else said, no, it's not that. I have no idea what aqua regia is. I know it's shiny. It looks like this. Somebody told me that chemically pure gold is almost white. If that's true, then this is maybe, I may be fooled, but I trust the jeweler from whom I bought my wedding ring. If there's a doubt, I can find a jeweler. If there's doubt, he can find a chemist. The fact is that my ability to refer to gold depends on other people with more expertise than I, and then they depend on samples. If there's some question about whether the tests are right, they can go back and study the samples some more. So both the stuff itself and other human beings are extremely important. I think, by the way, this is a disagreement. It occurred to me just last week that this is a disagreement in a way that goes back to Plato and Aristotle. Plato holds the semantic omnipotence view, the view that in principle any mind has all the ideas within itself, and Socrates could bring them out, but they were really all there. Whereas Aristotle says, no, you can only have a concept if some instances, or at least for the basic concepts, you can only have that concept if some instances actually occur in your experience from which you can extract that concept. The concepts aren't in you to start with. So I think this is, and I moved to this externalist, so maybe Aristotle was the first externalist, but I moved to this externalist view, which then says, no, a program by itself has no meaning. As Jerry Fodor has put it, programs by themselves are just syntax. You can't describe the mind just by describing the syntax of what it does. So that was one consideration. But on the other side, I became extremely doubtful that there's one way in which we manipulate any given idea, one program for manipulating any given idea. Because in general, what you do with an idea depends on what other ideas you have. And this is sometimes been called holism, Holism. That is the idea that our ideas form a system, and that you can't really say if somebody has this thought, that he must say so-and-so or think so-and-so under such and such circumstances. It depends really on the entire background and no way of surveying all the different possible backgrounds. Turing's claim was that if a machine could fool you, that you're not allowed to see the machine, I should add, in the Turing test, so you don't rely on its physical appearance. You're asked to carry on a conversation with it, say by means of an electric typewriter, I think as Turing envisaged it, or something like that. And you're also asked at the same time carrying on a conversation of the same sort with a human being you don't know. In each case, you say something or type something, and it types an answer, and you type something, and it types an answer, and so on. The task is to say which is the robot and which is the human being. And if the machine is so good that your chances of identifying it are 50-50, that is, right, basically you can't do better than chance at saying which is the machine and which is the real live human being, then that machine is conscious and is a thinker. This is Turing's claim. Now, I think it's fairly easy to see that, although there's a lot of resistance to admitting this, I think in fact it's fairly easy to see that that's wrong. One way to see what's left out is to imagine the following story. Consider two possible machines that both win the Turing test. The first, when you look at the answers it gives to different people, they cohere. Right? Something like a fictitious biography emerges. The other machine pretends, say, to be a sea captain in one conversation, a college professor in the next conversation, a policeman in the next conversation, an immigrant from Australia in the next conversation, and so on. So there's no coherent biography. So there's no possibility of even ascribing to it a consistent set of, say, desires and beliefs. I think in the end we say, no, that's not a conscious thinker. That's just a clever gadget for fooling people. So there are further requirements, I think, than being able to, in fact, it turns out that very simple programs can win the Turing Test. But more deeply, I think before we call something conscious, we would at least want coherence. Also, I think the incoherence, even if the machine told a coherent story, there's a sense in which the coherent story wouldn't cohere with its life. If you say to the machine, let's say after the day is over, okay, the day is over, what do you think about what happened? And it goes on telling you this story about, as it might be, being a mountain climber. One thing couldn't climb mountains, it has no arms, no legs, and about its wife, and it has no wife, and so on. I think, in fact, our verdict would flip. This thing isn't right. If the thing could say, phew, you know, that third guy, I thought he was going to tumble onto me, and so on, you know. It could tell you something that actually coheres not just with itself, but with the existence it actually has. Right? I mean, there's so much left out in Turing's account. I'm in the process of radically rethinking my view of the mind, but the idea that our present picture of the mind, that we mentioned earlier in the conversation, that our present picture of the mind is terribly shaped by the 17th century, by Descartes, has been coming back to me because more and more seems to me that we still accept too much of this view. And I would have to go back up a little to say what my new view is, because I want to reject the whole picture of sensation, especially, that came in with the 17th century. The picture that came in, and it was taken over then by it's not a matter of empiricists versus rationalists, because Descartes was a rationalist, but the empiricists took over the features that I'm going to be talking about totally. And I think Kant, unfortunately, kept them as well. And the picture that came in was that somehow sensation is essentially inside us. The picture is that when you look at something, say when you look at the books behind me, you have sensations which came to be conceived of as something taking place in an inner theater, as we say, inside the head or inside the mind, and we pass back and forth. We interchange these, and in ordinary language that's fine. But the picture is that, and Berkeley and Hume exploit this to devastating effect to create skeptical problems that haunt us to this day. Okay, if the book that I see is really inside my head, is it or is it not like the book out there? And if older view was, yes, there's the picture you see is inside your head, but it resembles the physical book out there. And then Berkeley say, oh, so a mental image can represent resemble a physical object. How is that? And a lot of people say, oh, that's a terrible question. You mustn't, once you even raise that question, you're lost. You mustn't even ask whether the mental book, the book inside your head, is or is not like the book out there. But then the book out there becomes what? A thing in itself. Right? And suddenly the whole world becomes, as it were, taken away from us, becomes problematic. And you have this big discussion, do we really know there's an external world? And I want to return to a view that I think is at least, was not so uncommon in ancient medieval philosophy, but I think has been lost as a possibility to us, which is that we actually see books. that we actually experience the external world and not just an internal representation of it. I mean, that means we're thinking a lot of things. And I have some help from current science. For example, the medievals Descartes claimed, and philosophers after Descartes, right through Bertrand Russell, claimed that modern science shows that objects aren't colored. And that already takes away the world, because we see, if you look at those books behind me, what you see is first the surfaces and the colored surfaces. And you say, that isn't really a property of those books, having those colors. You've already gone a long way to making the external world this problematic thing that we don't know what it is. And it occurred to me, yeah, but nobody says that things don't really have a temperature anymore. Temperature was another of those secondary qualities. And nobody really says that things don't have a temperature anymore. And why not? Well, because we in fact found an account of temperature, other than just saying, well, there's something about it which disposes us to have certain sensations. And I think that there's now a lot of work on the nature of color, which actually makes color much more objective than it used to look. For example, the old story was, well, color is very subjective, and when you say that this is red, you mean it has a disposition to produce a certain sensation. But there's a sense in which color is not very subjective. I mean, if I go walking in the woods with you, and the light is coming through the leaves, so the light is very greenish, your face will not change apparent color very much. In fact, I have to override mechanisms which some neurologists now believe are in the eye itself to be a good painter, and perceive how much greenish light is being reflected from your skin. And similarly, if it's dawn and a beautiful sunrise, or sunset is better, a beautiful sunset, and we're walking on a beach, an enormous amount of orange light is falling on your skin, I don't see your face as orange. In fact, Goethe noticed in his book on color, noticed a lot of these things and was dismissed just as a romantic who didn't know what he was talking about for centuries. It now turns out that the eye itself, at least according to Jerome Letvin, who's one of the great neurologists formerly at MIT, now at Rutgers, that the eye itself automatically compensates for all these changes in the ambient light, so as to try to estimate what he calls objective reflectancies. That the colors of things, or more precisely the colors from a certain position, are as an objective a property of those things as their temperature is. I mean, it always takes philosophy a while to catch up with changes in the scientific image. But I think that all the arguments for this whole idea of that you can't see that colors are not real properties of external things, that we can't perceive real properties of external things, that all the properties we perceive are really inside us, are a combination of outmoded science and mistaken arguments. And we have to see our way back to the idea that it's philosophically respectable to claim we have unmediated access to the external world. So that's one change in my view of the mind. It says, it doesn't deny that mental properties, say what you perceive, depends on physical processes, but it says with John Dewey that the physical processes aren't all inside the brain. What I see is transactional in Dewey's term, that it's the whole transaction, the whole interaction between myself and what I'm looking at or touching or hearing or tasting or smelling, etc., that is the, as it were, physical basis for the experience. If you like, our experiences aren't just inside our skin. First of all, I'm rethinking my view of perception. I'm moving towards what is called direct realism. That is the idea that we actually perceive real properties of things and not sensations conceived of as intermediaries, as something inside us, like a movie screen with a problematic relation to the things. Now, the part of the problem here is that what was once philosophy has now almost become common sense. Even the man on the street has now talks the way the philosophers taught him to talk for 3 centuries. And so there's a kind of reversal of sophistication, what I call a second naivete, that has to be brought about, a kind of recovery of the world that I am aiming at here. And I think I want to extend this in a certain way to conception as well. I want to say, yes, conception, in a way this fits in with the externalism about meaning that I described before. I want to say, yes, conception isn't, the ability to refer to things outside of me isn't just something inside my head. It's not a matter of manipulating a representation which has some kind of a magical relation to what I am referring to. Referring to things is an ability that I have. It depends on the use of language, but I think the idea that it has to be broken up into two parts, a manipulation of a representation entirely inside the brain, in a way that's entirely syntactical, as Jerry Fodor posits, plus a relation between this representation and what's outside, which can then only be magical. It seems to me that that also has to be deeply wrong. In a way, then, it means that much of what I'm trying to do in this area of philosophy is to change our conception of what the problems are. I mean, we now conceive the problems almost entirely in reductionist terms. The problem is a reduction, in some sense, perhaps a generous or loose sense, but a reduction of the semantical to the non-semantical, or the mental to the non-mental. And then we're constantly being threatened that if we can't do that, then you're positing magic. And I'm trying to say, no, we have to learn to accept that a great deal of this is not reducible, but that is not to say that something magical is at work here. The very idea that it must be magical, that reason itself must be magical if it can't be naturalized, as people say, is, I think, a deep mistake. I wrote an article on AI in the magazine Dualist, in which I argued that, said that, look, as far as I know, AI has not yet taught us one single thing of real significance about cognition. I mean, the promise of machines that could speak a natural language is as far off as it ever was. No one has the least idea how to go about doing that. I should take that back. Pattern recognition we have learned something about, and something important and interesting about. But about induction, natural language use, reasoning, we have not. These problems are still enormously resistant as ever. I think resistant in principle. And Dennis' response was, when you're saying the mind is chaos. And I would say, no, I'm saying this is not the right way to think about it. I mean, the very idea that either think about it in the currently fashionable way or it's chaos is just a sign of the hold of fashion. I think there are billions of different kinds of properties and not reducible to each other. It would be very mysterious, in fact. If there were only two would be fishy, I think, if there are exactly two sorts of properties in the world. That would be a little fishy. Once you recognize that, in fact, the reducibility of one sort of discourse to another is really an exceptional case. Even in science, really, reduction is a pretty rare thing, where a property of one science can really be defined using the concepts of a lower level science. I mean, the reason we use the example of light is electromagnetic radiation over and over and over again is it's almost the only clean example. Even that other famous example, temperature is mean molecular kinetic energy. Well, yeah, temperature of a pure gas, of an ideal gas, is mean molecular kinetic energy, but that's not what the temperature of the table is, or the temperature of my hand is, or the temperature of the coffee is. And at that point, it all gets much more complicated. So I think there is a tremendous hold right now, and it's increasing in strength. It's not decreasing, of reductionist thinking. And I see it as a task of the kind of philosophy I do to fight a defensive war against this, because I think it's bad for the culture, bad for the mind. At one time, I stumbled and said that there is no real world independent of our conceptual system. And that, I think, was a terrible thing to say. I talked of mind dependence. That, I think, was a terrible thing to say. What I meant, of course, was that the world, which is independent of our minds, does not dictate one unique set of concepts which must be used to describe it. It doesn't care whether I decide to describe it in the language of merological sums or in some other language which doesn't tolerate merological sums, provided I get all the facts, in some sense of all the facts stated. But I think talking about mind dependence is bad. On the other hand, I would accuse the metaphysical realist of using the term independence often in an equally irresponsible and unclear way. For example, metaphysical realists, I've been in debates many times, they would say things like, oh, the world is independent of what you or I or anyone may think about it. And I said, but look, isn't it the case that most of the stuff we talk about wouldn't exist if human beings hadn't had certain thoughts? A chair is, after all, an artifact. It's something designed to be sat upon. If nobody had had the thought that they wanted to make something to be sat upon, there would be no chairs. There's so much of it. Sure, there are things like Mount Everest and the stars, which would exist even if human thinkers didn't exist. But obviously a great deal of what we talk about is mind-dependent in the most literal sense, causally the product, at least in part, of human thoughts and intentions. And so again, and they might say, well, we don't mean causal. You know, I mean, if they said an awful lot, most of the universe is causally independent of us, that's fine. But if they say in some sense, which is never explained, of independent, the whole thing is independent. Peirce went so far as to say that even our thoughts are independent, but I don't know what that means. And, you know, I think terms like dependent and independent are probably disasters, certainly unless it's explained in exactly which sense, with exactly what kind of dependence is supposed to be at issue. Actually, a lot of things that aren't artifacts are also causally influenced by human beings. It's very hard now to find a forest anywhere in the world which would be as it is if there weren't human beings. What we call nature in the continent of Europe and in the continent of America, of North America, is through and through shaped by man. It's not an accident that I had to go to something like Mount Everest or the moon to find something which is clearly untouched by man. Even space in the near vicinity is getting full of Coke bottles and stuff. So in that sense, I would say clearly it can't be causal dependence. Sometimes people say, well, it's a question of logical independence. But even that is, I think, not right. I think that in Reason, Truth, and History, I tried saying, I defended the view that a statement can be true if and only if it's logically possible for human beings to find out that it's true, or for thinkers, or I didn't say human beings, but for thinkers, not necessarily human thinkers, to find out that it's true. I think now that that was a mistake, but I also think it's a mistake to say that, again, if one says any proposition you like, any state truth you like, every truth is such that it could be true, and yet thinkers might not be able to find out that it's true, is also wrong. The answer is it's more complicated than that. For ordinary statements about things like chairs in this room, it is, in fact, the case that it can't be true that there's a chair in this room unless it's also the case that one could know there's a chair in this room, because part of the concept of a chair is that it's big enough to see, it's possible to sit on it, and so on. And things as elementary as this are overlooked by philosophers, and the only possible reason is that philosophy has, I'm afraid, adopted, and for a long time back now, a kind of almost an adversarial system, in the sense in which the law courts have an adversarial system, in which you're either in this faction or this faction. And if you go along with this faction, like Republicans and Democrats, if you're in this faction, then you have to go along with these slogans, even if you're hard with hearts, you know they're overkill. Like, everything is totally independent, whether human beings could find it out or not. And if you're in the other faction, everything is totally dependent on whether human beings could find it out or not. And somebody who says, well, there's a middle way here, but the middle way is subtle and nuanced. Is maybe a little bit of a voice crying in the wilderness. But I would characterize my middle way in an indirect way. I would say I'm trying to find a way to separate, to return to common sense, or better, to distinguish, because between what the kind of realism that we really need in order to live our lives and to think straight about all issues, including ethical issues, by the way, from philosophical overkill that has crept in and that I think both confuses us and also leads to, I think, more than just intellectual confusion. It has, for example, the illusions about artificial intelligence, I think, had real-world consequences, both in the economy and in the university, some of which were good and some of which are pretty pernicious. I have a story which I could tell about that. My friend and friendly antagonist, Richard Rorty, and I were having a discussion in Normandy for a group of French philosophers. And he said, you defend common sense realism. I think common sense realism is just as bad as metaphysical realism. One leads to the other. And I said, well, Dick, if I say that the reason I think that there are a lot of people in this room is that I see that there are, that doesn't seem to me like a metaphysical thesis. Isn't that a piece of plain common sense? And his answer was, yes, and that's the part of common sense we should give up. Now, this is how far a modern, sophisticated philosopher with a taste for the postmoderns is prepared to go. And I think we've gotten into a very deep confusion when the thing is like that. Rorty likes to say, and using Kantian language, that we have no access to unconceptualized reality. And I say, yeah, but that doesn't mean that we can't talk about things that are outside of our own skins. Now, how can that be? Well, I think that for me, although we both might utter these same words, you can't talk, we have no access to unconceptualized reality, I think we mean very different things by them. Or at least I think Rorty hasn't thought through what he means by those words. Because he talks as if this were, there are, in spite of himself, he talks at times as if there were an unconceptualized reality and it's behind a wall and we can't get to it. I mean, he would say, no, I don't think that. That's a misreading. But the idea that anything, but I want to say, no, the very notion of an unconceptualized reality, or rather an unconceptualizable reality, because there's lots of reality that we haven't yet conceptualized because we haven't learned about it yet, right? We're going to learn of some new particle next week, and right now it's unconceptualized, but next week somebody will have a concept of it. That's not the issue, but when you think of an unconceptualizable reality, then I want to say I think this notion is a nonsense notion. As the only reality we can talk about is reality we can at least in part conceptualize. That there are features of something which are incomprehensible to us, that's something else. But in general, I want to say that the world that we can talk about and think about is a world that is, to some extent at least, conceptualizable by us, and that that world here has fallen into a Kantian picture, as if there were a world of things in themselves, and at last we can't get all the way to things in themselves, and so we're driven back inside that inner sensorium that I talked about a while back inside our own heads. I said, look, we can talk about tables and chairs and other people, and that is talking about things outside ourselves and talking about real things outside ourselves. It's Hans Reichenbach, who, although usually classified as one of the greatest of the logical positivists, never called himself a positivist because he didn't like the positivist doctrine that all you can really talk about in the last analysis is your own sense data. And in his great book, Experience and Prediction, he said, if I believe that, why would I buy a life insurance policy? I've said that the belief that language and thought refer to something outside ourselves plays an essential role in human life. And I would explain that the following way. That little example of Reichenbach's, I think, of the life insurance policies is very deep. Because if I thought that all I'm doing when I utter words is trying to predict what sense data I will have in the future, then worrying about what will happen after I die could only make sense as worrying about what I will learn about while I'm still alive, about what will happen after I die. And that's simply not what I'm worrying about when I'm worried about how my children and grandchildren and my wife will get on after I'm gone. I once remembered a conference, Dick Rorty and I organized a conference together in Paris on truth in 1990. It was a fun conference, and I said to Dick, your view is very much like the positive view. They viewed the whole purpose of language solipsistically. I am using this language as a way of predicting what sense data I will have in the future. A real solipsist is, of course, someone who believes that nothing exists except himself and his dream, as it were, his experiences. And a lot of philosophers philosophize as if solipsism were true. And then, of course, they say this is only methodological solipsism or something like that. And I say, but you, Dick, don't talk about predicting sense data, but you talk about coping. Look, Dick, when you say that language is just marks and noises that we utter in order to help ourselves cope or to help make other people happy and maximize human happiness, is this just marks and noises that you utter in order to help you cope? And he said, yes. I mean, I think logically he's in the same position as the positivists. The only difference is they valorized prediction, and he valorizes happiness. But basically, the images are remarkably similar. You have this language as just marks and noises that I use for certain self-contained purposes which are entirely inside me. And I would say that isn't the way any of us lives. And I think I've learned a good deal from American pragmatism, a debt I've acknowledged repeatedly. I have disagreements with pragmatism, but this debt I've acknowledged repeatedly. One thing I've learned from pragmatism, I think that in philosophy we should start by taking seriously the way we think and talk and find we have to think and talk in order to lead our lives. It's no good saying, strictly speaking, the whole world is inside my head or it's just my sensations. But of course I have to think the opposite in order to live at all. I'm a scientific realist in the following senses. First, I think that there's no serious difference in the reality status of scientific objects and common sense objects. As I said in a little while ago, I think that even with respect to observability, I don't see that there's a fundamental difference between observing something, an epistemologically important difference between observing something with the aid of an instrument and observing it with the eye. It's true that you have to know something about the instrument. But in fact, as Ian Hacking once pointed out, you can often use an instrument very well to make observations while having a totally wrong theory of why it works. In fact, that seems to have been the case with the microscope. Our understanding of the optics of the microscope was fundamentally wrong for a long time. But we knew what we were certainly seeing real little bugs, and any other explanation of what we were observing would have been crazy. In that respect, it's somewhat analogous to seeing something with the eye while having a very wrong idea about how the eye works, which also happened in ancient times. So in that, and I think that a lot of the problems, including my own attitudes in Reason, Truth, and History, this is the part of Reason, Truth, and History that I would now repudiate, the idea that somehow maybe we can directly refer or really refer to a few things, presumably inside us, like our own thoughts, but everything else is somehow theoretical and therefore subject to incompatible interpretations. Quantum mechanics is a case where no one has succeeded in figuring out, and I say this as someone who tried myself for 25 years, as no one has succeeded in coming up with, I think, with a compelling interpretation. The theory works wonderfully, and we really cannot say why it works. And in a way, it points to the limits of the kind of philosophy that I've just been talking about, because, of course, if there's one thing we can't observe, even with the aid of instruments, it's the so-called wave function of quantum mechanics. And it's, in a way, not so, perhaps it fits with what I've been saying, that when you run beyond the limits of even extended observability, you run precisely the case where you really have great difficulty in knowing what to say about questions like real or not. Right? I mean, the fundamental problem is that the wave itself, the so-called wave, the psi function or the wave, is in principle not observable. Some of its effects are observable, but not enough to count as really saying we observe. So questions like, well, does it collapse or not, seem, at least within the bounds of our present knowledge and our present theory, beyond what we can hope to answer by actually, say, setting up a wave measuring apparatus, which will tell us whether, as some interpretations require, it collapses, or whether, as other interpretations would have it, it never collapses. And all we can do is think about it. And maybe we could solve this problem by thinking about it if we came up with one beautiful, compelling story that everyone would say, yeah, that's the most reasonable story. But today I like to say interpretations of quantum mechanics are typically believed by their inventor and a half a dozen of his friends, and not by anybody else. So I wouldn't regard that as a reason for adopting a purely instrumental view, that is, about adopting that all we're really talking about is our instruments. I don't think even Bohr really believed that, although he may have believed that that's the best we can hope to. I mean, I think Bohr's counsel was partly a counsel of despair, that he thought that we are never going to understand quantum mechanics, or that it's intrinsically beyond the power of the human mind to understand it in the categories that are the only categories he thought we have available to us, space, time, and causality. And he might be right, but I don't think we should assume that he's right. I mean, I think we should go on trying. The nature of the Einstein-Bohr disagreement is very complex. We now know that it was not fundamentally, for example, it was portrayed for a long time, a disagreement over causality versus probability. That Einstein's deep objections to the Bohr interpretation had nothing to do with whether the ultimate laws had to be deterministic or could be statistical. This has been dug up by various people. Don Howard, historian of science at Kentucky, the philosopher of science, Arthur Fine, did excellent pioneering work in discovering documents and so on, which really show the much deeper nature of the dispute. When I myself met Einstein once in 1953, when I first came to Princeton, and what we talked about, he was utterly charming, and what he talked about was quantum mechanics, and he did not mention, so much as mention, the issue of probability versus determinism in our conversation. What he focused on was the implausibility of the so-called collapse of the wave function. As I remember how he put it, he said, if I believe that theory, I would have to say that when I'm not in my bedroom, the bed is spread out all over the room, and when I open the door and look, it collapses into that one place. It is a wonderfully witty way of putting it, and it makes it quite clear that, you know, and he would clearly have objected to that even if the mechanism was wholly deterministic. I've asked myself, to what extent am I a realist about scientific theories other than quantum mechanics? First of all, I would be a realist about quantum mechanics too if I knew how. Right? I mean, it's certainly describing something that's really there, but whether we can figure out what it is or have to, in the end, to say, here we've discovered a formalism which works better than we know why. I don't know, and I don't think we can guess. I do think two things. One is that with respect to scientific theories we really understand, I am a realist with respect to them in the same sense that I'm a common sense realism. Sometimes they have alternative formulations which are equally true. Classical physics, we know, can be interpreted as an action at a distance theory, but it can also be interpreted without action at a distance. And as the duality of fields and particles, which is famous in connection with quantum mechanics, actually existed already in classical electrodynamics, the theory of the electromagnetic field. As in fact, a lot of the phenomena of quantum mechanics are already anticipated, or a lot of the problems in connection with quantum mechanics are already anticipated in connection with the theory of the electromagnetic field, including the fact that you have some trade-off as to whether you can describe a phenomenon as due to magnetism or due to electricity, which was something that Einstein was impressed by, and one of the things that led Einstein to invent the theory of special relativity, to give an account of how that could be. I would say that a lot of philosophies of science, what I do think, though, is that it's futile to try to find one account of scientific method which fits absolutely all scientific theories. Different scientific theories have very different histories. There's very different things that make it rational to accept them. I've heard, for example, molecular biologists say that depending on exactly which culture you study, you may be dealing with phenomena which are highly reproducible or phenomena which are almost impossible to reproduce. And if that's true even within one area, or even within physics itself, there are areas like where everything is both experimentally checkable and theoretically highly describable, and then there are areas like the theory of turbulent fluids, a theory which is used both for things that are literally fluids like water or air, which is, I guess, literally a fluid for a physicist, and then also for the interior of the sun or in the interior of stars. And there, I've heard one of the great authorities on the subject say, typically we're extrapolating for phenomena 10 orders of magnitude, that is, one with 10 zeros after it, bigger or louder or stronger or weaker than the phenomena we're applying this to. With respect, for example, why a given horn will produce the particular noise it does, this is in general something that you cannot predict with paper and pencil calculation. So that there are enormous differences here. Now, why do I mention this? Well, because there are little models that we like to give kids, say, in their first science class or their first philosophy of science class. Like, you have a theory, and the theory implies a prediction, and you go out and look if the prediction is true, and lo and behold, it's true. And that's how you know the theory is right. I was talking to Professor Ahrens, a astrophysicist at Berkeley last week, who said, yeah, in my field it rarely happens that way. It's almost always that you stumble over something and then you figure out what you stumbled over. Popper wanted to say, well, a theory is good only if it implies a falsifiable prediction. And he said, and the great example of that was the special theory of the general theory of relativity. Look at that eclipse experiment where they predicted that light would be deflected by when it passed close to the sun, and they took these pictures of stars during a total eclipse. It had to be during a total eclipse, but otherwise you wouldn't get a picture of the stars. You know, you needed stars that are close to the sun or whose apparent position is close to the sun. So the light from them passes close to the sun, but you have to block out the sun so you see the stars. So they waited for a total eclipse, and they took these photos, and this Popper told the story, and all of us believed it for a long time. Einstein turned out to be right, and he took this big risk, because if he hadn't been right, his theory would have been falsified. And then I think John Ehrman wrote this paper, and Clark Gleamore wrote this paper pointing out that it wasn't like that at all. There were, I think, 4 sets of plates, and one showed Einsteinian deviation, and one showed Newtonian deviation, and one showed double Einsteinian deviation, and there were some blurred plates, and so on. And in fact, it was not till the 70s that we had good, very precise, detailed, wonderful experimental proof of general relativity. But the theory was widely accepted long before that because of its plausibility, simplicity, elegance, and so on, all the considerations that Popper would have said are irrelevant. Evolutionary theory is not falsifiable at all, which is why Popper never considered it a science. But it's crazy not to consider evolutionary theory a science. It's a marvelous fit, first in the 30s with the then evolving genetics, and now again, evolutionary theory is being transformed again by incorporating into it newer knowledge of genetic mechanisms, which is again reshaping our understanding of the details. If you don't allow that features like integrability, the ability to be harmonized and put together with the rest of the science that's developing, then you can't account for it. I would say that quantum mechanics best fits actually Popper's story. We accept it not because we understand it, because we don't, but because it leads to predictions to more decimal places than we ever imagined a scientific theory could lead to true predictions, and continues to surprise us with how immensely accurate it is, even though, as I say, we understand it only in the sense of knowing how to manipulate it mathematically. There's a whole range of cases where prediction counts most, cases where plausibility and coherence counts most, cases where fit with other scientific theories counts. As far as I'm concerned, the attempt, when philosophers of science try to produce one model and say, this is the model for how you accept a scientific theory, they always exaggerate enormously. I keep meaning to do some research into when these terms coherence, like coherence theory of truth, really emerged. I know that stuff I've read from late 19th century, early 20th century, after William James, frequently speaks of 3 theories of truth: the coherence theory of truth, and the pragmatist theory of truth, and the correspondence theory of truth. And some people now talk about a 4th, so-called deflationist theory of truth. And I think that this classification, with or without the addition of the 4th, is a disaster. I mean, I think every one of these terms is misleading. The idea that, well, first of all, I think there are a lot of problems. I mean, the coherence theory of truth is supposed to be that what makes a belief true is that it coheres with other things we believe, and which I think makes no sense outside of a totally idealist picture. Right? I think even for Hegelian it probably makes no sense, because the whole, probably Hegel would want to say the whole opposition between coherence and correspondence is just exactly what I was trying to overcome. But the correspondence is, I think, the term correspondence is thrown around without usually any clear statement as to what is correspondence a relation? I mean, is this just a way of saying what Aristotle said, to say what is that it is, and to say what isn't that it isn't is true, to which no one can object? Or is it seriously being said that we can explain why things are true, namely that they bear a certain relation to certain things, in which case I want to know what sorts of things. Is it sentences? Is it in the sense of marks and noises? Is it thoughts? Is it judgments? None of the foregoing. I mean, what are the relata, and what is it that they bear a relation to? The world as a whole, reality as a whole, objects called facts. I mean, the term correspondence theory of truth creates the illusion of that you know what's being talked about when nothing has yet been said, as I think both Kant and William James said, and well, I think the pragmatist theory of truth was a mistake, but that's another story. So I think that the idea that we have to choose between these three disasters is what I would inveigh against. I think, to begin with, I think it's important to notice not to shove the problem cases into a corner. I mean, problem cases, I mean like mathematical truth or logical truth, and then bring them out only much later. Because I think what happens, especially with people who say they believe in the correspondence theory of truth, is that they focus on descriptions. In the case of and they make it sound as if the only kind of truth there is, for a sentence to be true is for it, or a thought to be true, or judgment to be true. And as I say, there's a range of possibilities here, of very different possibilities. I don't think of thoughts are marks and noises, and that's a difference between myself and a lot of logicians who think what's true or false are sentences, and sentences are just certain marks or certain noises. And I don't know what it would be for a mark or a noise to be true. But basically there's a tremendous emphasis on description. So we look at something like my saying, there's a brown cow with white spots, and what makes it true is that there is over there a brown cow with white spots. And that certainly is one kind of truth. But I want to say, but then if you think that having understood, let us say, what it is for a description or a certain kind of description, because description itself is, I think, a very inhomogeneous category. But having understood what it is for one kind of description to be right or true, you say, and now I've given you a theory of truth, and then you encounter a statement like 5 and 7 or 12. See, now you think, well, then the only way that can be true is if they're objects. You know, and Professor Ryan's spoken of numbers are intangible objects, he says. So suddenly you're forced to regard arithmetic as a description of an extraordinary realm, an intangible realm. And when you come to just pure logic, that is a principle like if A implies B and B implies C, then A implies C. Is that a description? I mean, there's a tremendous problem in general with the area of conceptual truth, in that on the one hand, one wants it to be infallible, and on the other hand, you want it to have content. And if your image of content is descriptive content, then you're pushed to positing objects which necessarily exist, or which could not be there. And I think that while we can say of a statement that it's true, if we can operate with the statement according to the rules of logic, I mean, here I go back to the German logician Frege, right? In general, anything that's within the scope of rational thinking, and in particular of logic, is subject to being called true or false. I don't think that everything that is subject to being true or false in that sense is a description. And I think as long as we think that everything that's true or false has to be a description of some realm, we won't understand ethical truth, we won't understand logical truth, we won't understand mathematical truth. I've said in Reason, Truth, and History, I myself said that truth is an idealized rational acceptability. I think now that's wrong, but in a sense, not, although right in some cases. Let me explain what I mean. I think that by an idealization of rational acceptability, I didn't literally mean that there are such a thing as ideal circumstances. What I meant is that as you make the circumstances better and better, the epistemic circumstances for deciding on whether S is true or false better and better, you will more and more come to the verdict that S is the case. So that's very much like Peirce. That was my closest approach to pragmatism. That seems to me wrong now because although, well, it was different from pragmatism in the following respect. For Peirce and James, better circumstances are in the future. And I had nothing about, and I rejected that explicitly. For me, it might be that the best epistemic circumstances are in the past or have long gone by, because I was always aware of this problem about the past, and I never wanted to make truth about statement about the past in any way dependent on what happens in the future. But nevertheless, I did the key assumption is that it makes no sense to say that suppose that something is true if there would be no way in which one could ever know that it's true. But it seems to me that there are, unfortunately, some simple counterexamples to that. An example I use constantly nowadays is that it might be true that there are no intelligent extraterrestrials. It might be true that we're alone in the universe. And if that's true, then according to our best physical theory, we could never know that it's true. Information can't get to us faster than light, which means that the part of the universe that is possible for us to have information about is maybe pathetically small. So if there are no intelligent extraterrestrials at all, that would be a truth which could not, there's no sense of saying, well, but under ideal epistemic circumstances, it would be warranted in saying that it's true if it is. It is a truth that would transcend our ability to find out. On the other hand, if somebody says, there are chairs in this room, I would say it makes no sense to say that that's a truth which transcends our abilities to find out. I think for many common sense truths, there's even a conceptual link between their being true as being the case that if epistemic circumstances were good enough, we could say that they're true. But I don't think that can be a definition of truth. As I suggested before, the attempt to find one characterization of truth that covers every kind of truth seems to me now doomed to failure. It's like the attempt to find one account of the scientific method which covers every single kind of scientific situation, every single kind of scientific hypothesis. It's a tendency in philosophy to look for the generalization that covers all the cases, and we always lose, but we can't resist trying. The brain in a vat example, which is, I need a little stage setting because it comes to a conclusion that people find very counterintuitive. Very few people have ever accepted the argument, even though it proceeds from premises that many of them accept, which means that then they have great difficulty in explaining why they don't accept the argument. See, I mentioned before that I'm an externalist about reference. Like Aristotle, that is, I don't think we can refer to just anything whatsoever, no matter how impoverished our access to the world has been. Like Aristotle, I think that if you can refer to something, well, sometimes you can refer to something because you're able to describe it. That is, you can use language to extend the range of things you can refer to. You can refer to things you've had no causal contact with, like when I just referred to extraterrestrials or absence of extraterrestrials in regions of space and time which are too far away from us for us to have any measurements of them, any signals from them, light by the time light from them reaches where we are, we will have long ceased to exist, etc. I've referred to something which I have no causal contact with, but I've described it using primitive notions like light, the speed of light, place, distance, and so on, all of which refer to things that we do have experience with. And in Aristotle's language, I've had access to particulars which instance those universals, and so those universals got into my mind, and then using them I can then build up, with the aid of logical words like all and no and some and if then, I can build up descriptions of things I have not experienced. But still, what I can ultimately, it can't be that every word I understand, every concept I understand, I learn by a description. That would be I would get an infinite regress or a vicious circle. There have to be some basis of concepts that I understand, although I've not learned them via description. And with respect to those, it may be that there's no unique choice of which they are, that one person learns one group as basic and another group by description, and for another person it's the reverse. But for each person in the history of the language learning, there's some group of concepts which are not learned by description. For a small child, first learning the language, nothing is learned by description. And with respect to these concepts that we learn by, Russell would have called it acquaintance, I want to say it's necessary that we have some kind of, as with Aristotle, it's necessary we have some kind of causal interaction, in fact, of an appropriate kind, which means, among other things, it must be an information-carrying causal interaction with things that exemplify those concepts. And I call this a causal constraint on reference. Some people speak of a causal theory of reference, but I've never had a theory of reference in the sense of a definition of reference or necessary and sufficient conditions. But I do think there are necessary conditions there are constraints on reference, especially with respect to natural kinds and natural relations, spatial relations, physical relations, and so on. As I say, this is a widely popular view among analytic philosophers. But now it has the following, it has counterintuitive consequence. The other thing I need for my little argument, before I introduce the brains in a vat, is a principle of modern logic, which again sounds very simple, which is that, to use Tarski's famous example by another Polish logician, Alfred Tarski, if I say the sentence "snow is white" is true if and only if snow is white. Or you can even make it simpler, the words, quote, "snow" refers to snow, or the words, quote, "duck" refers to ducks. That all statements of that form, quotes "p," where "p" is a word, a name, refers to peas, are necessarily true. This is sometimes called the disquotation principle. If you have a word, if you write down a word in quotes, like quotes, ducks, close quotes, and then write the word refers to, and then write the same word without quotes. So what you've written now is quotes, ducks, close quotes, refers to ducks. Any sentence of that form will always be true. And that's sometimes called the disquotational property of reference. And "snow is white," quotes, "snow is white," close quotes, "is true if and only if," and then you write the same sentence, "snow is white." That's called the disquotational property of truth. Okay, now I ask, could it be that we human beings, all of us, are really brains in a vat? That is to say, we don't really have bodies the way we think we are. We're just brains floating in a nutrient fluid. There's a machine, a computer with a chemical factory attached to it, which keeps the nutrient fluid right so that our brains are good and healthy as long as they're supposed to be. Of course, they really age, and some of them really die. That's not an illusion, but... and moreover, there are wires leading from our brains to the computer, so that there genuinely are impulses being fed into our brains, and there are impulses coming out of our brains to the computer, and the computer arranges it. So we experience what seems to us the external world. When I volitionally raise my hand, the computer arranges it so I see my hand rising. And when I say something, the computer arranges it so I hear my voice, and moreover you hear my voice, and so on. But really it's just an image. Our world, we really exist, but our world is really just an image arranged by a computer. Moreover, you might say, well, at least there would be real people outside the computer. But I said, well, it's not logically necessary. Suppose that the world, some physicists once said, you take the universe you get. Suppose the universe we got is one in which all there is this computer and this chemical factory, completely automated, no sentient beings, unless the computer counts as sentient beings, and all the sentient beings are in the vat being given the solution by the computer, and they'll never get out, and they'll never know, and they couldn't know. Now, most people say that's a real skeptical worry. I understand that worry. Of course, they may say you should dismiss it because you can't do anything with it, or some people have arguments that it's a priori improbable, although how probability can be a priori is something I've never understood. But most people are deeply convinced that they can understand this hypothesis. And I say, well, but that's incompatible with these two principles which most of us accept. That is the idea that there are causal constraints on reference and the disquotational property of reference. Why? Well, the argument is very short. Let's call the language that the people in the vat world, that the BIVs, the brains in the vat, speak, vat English. So you can say the question of whether we're brains in a vat is the same question as whether we're speaking English or vat English. So how do I know that I'm not speaking vat English? Well, first of all, in my language, and I'll just say in my language, the word, let's say the word duck refers to ducks by the disquotational property of reference. Can brains in a vat refer to ducks? No, because they have no causal interaction whatsoever with real ducks. In fact, there aren't any real ducks in the brain in the vat world, nor with any properties in terms of which they could frame a definition of a duck. The concept of a duck is absolutely inaccessible to them. Of course, they have a word duck, but what it refers to is let us say, bit ducks, that is probably little pieces, information carrying strings in the computer. That's what their word duck corresponds to. Now, so it follows from the causal constraint on reference that in vat English the word duck does not refer to ducks. But in my language, the word duck does refer to ducks. A fortiori, my language is not vat English, so I'm not a brain in a vat. End of proof. Now, I found, as I say, people rarely accept this argument, and it was thinking about why they don't that led me to this notion of semantic omniscience that I talked about earlier. I think Aristotle would have accepted my argument. And I think whether you accept it or not, and there are other philosophers who do, depends on whether you're at bottom you think we're semantically omniscient, which is what Descartes thought, as you think, no, my God, I know that I could think about ducks no matter what. That's part of the innate furniture of my mind, the ability to think about real ducks, which is exactly Descartes' view was. One student of the history of philosophy, John Carriero, argued that Descartes' view of the human mind is exactly Thomas Aquinas' view of the angelic mind. Angels, for Aquinas, had the ability to think about anything whatsoever without having any sense organs. But with respect to humans, Aquinas was a good Aristotelian. And I think we want to believe that we have angelic minds. And so we think the brain and vat argument must be wrong. In a sense, it really brings out whether you are an Aristotelian or a Platonist, whether you think we're semantically omniscient or we think ultimately we're deeply dependent on how we're embedded in the world. What we can mean by reality is how much we can mean by even by a word like reality is dependent on how we're embedded in the world. So I think in a way the argument is deeply useful in connecting a whole lot of issues in philosophy of mind and metaphysics. The brain-to-vet argument is very often used in connection with skepticism. I myself present it as my argument is defeating one form of skepticism. That is, people say, yeah, but it defeats such a narrow form of skepticism. After all, and your own argument doesn't exclude, depended on the assumption that the vat is so rigged that there's no connection between the images and, say, real ducks and real trees and so on. You could rig it differently. You could suppose that we were all real people until last week, and now we've been invatted overnight. So we still possess these concepts, which did have causal connections. And so, but I would say, yeah, that's true. It doesn't defeat every sort of form of that argument. But notice there is something really funny about using the brain in a vat argument, hypothesis for skeptical purposes, which wasn't true of the evil demon version of it, which was Descartes' demon, that we might all be immaterial souls and the whole external world might be a dream imposed on us by an evil demon. The problem with using any form of a brain in a vat argument for skeptical purposes is that you're already assuming, if the brain in a vat, if the computers aren't to be we know not what, if they're real computers, and you're assuming that we have brains, you're assuming that our brains have neurons, you're assuming that they are electrochemical, you're assuming that their welfare depends on chemistry. In short, you're assuming, in fact, that we're right about an awful lot. You're assuming we're right about how nature in general works, about the general laws of nature. There's an awful lot that we're not wrong about there being an external world on this version of skepticism. On this version of skepticism, there is an external world, and we're right about that, and we're even right about the general laws it obeys. We're just wrong about the particular things that we think we see. And I would say, yeah, but then once you've granted that our basic scientific worldview is right about so much, it's legitimate for me to ask you, then what basis do you have for supposing that suddenly there might be wrong about these things, other than sheer logical possibility? Sheer logical possibility, I grant you, but I think sheer logical possibility of error is not, here I again agree with the pragmatists, even though I disagreed with their theory of truth. I think sheer logical possibility that what I say might be wrong is not enough to be a grounds for real doubt. I think that the pragmatists are saying, translated in non-psychological language, that doubt requires justification as well as belief. And so my view of that, my answer to this type of skeptic is justify your doubt. I think that it's important in philosophy to connect the different fields. For example, to connect issues in ethics with issues in epistemology. And I think because once one does that, one begins to see the issues in a different light. For example, lots of people think, well, there are no objective values. Somehow objective values belief in objective values is a relic of the past. In a modern scientific age, we have to give up the idea that there can be objective values. Not all naturalists believe that, as I mentioned. There are the Cornell moral realists, but many people, perhaps a majority of analytic philosophers, think that objective values are some kind of an illusion, and because somehow what could they be? How could they fit into a scientific world picture? Well, partly I think that's a confusion because it assumes that if ethics is objective, then it must be a description. And so already the kind of picture of language is very uniform, and all having one way of functioning is already, I think, built into a lot of the worries about ethics. But also, the same people often are quite comfortable in talking about, say, justification in science, or rational acceptability, or warranted assertability, and so on, without a qualm. And yet, being warranted, being simple, being coherent, being plausible, these are value terms. They're not moral value terms, but they are what you would call epistemic value terms. In fact, in 19th century, axiology, as Peirce understood it, included both a theory of epistemic value and a theory of moral value. And in fact, all of the arguments which are customarily used to argue that ethics can't be objective, for example, well, cultures disagree, and we don't know whether we'll ever all come into agreement on, and so on. All of these objections could be raised against epistemic values. There are disagreements between cultures on what's simple, what's plausible, what's more coherent than what. It's sometimes argued there's something funny about the notion of obligation. It somehow seems both something you can believe and something that's action guiding, and that's queer. But believing that a theory is superior all around to another on the score of plausibility, simplicity, coherence, is also action guiding. I want to say that, of course, somebody like Rorty would welcome this. He would say, see, you should give up all notions of objectivity. I think more people, if they came to see that Rorty is right in the following sense, that if you don't believe in ethical objectivity, then consistency, if those are your reasons, then consistency requires you give up epistemic objectivity as well. I think more people would agree with me that that's the best argument there could be for hanging on to moral objectivity, rather than agree with Rorty in giving the whole idea of objectivity up. So this is, and I think this is the sort of argument that one can perceive only when one says, well, if I believe this argument in this area, that is, in this case, say, the arguments of John Mackey, who wrote a book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, against moral objectivity, I believe Mackey's arguments over here. What would happen if I applied those same arguments over in this other area, epistemology? I think that it is important for there to be such a thing as public philosophy in the sense in which John Dewey was a public philosopher, and in the sense in which in Europe there are a number of public philosophers. Jürgen Habermas, Sartre was a public philosopher, Derrida is today, and Lyotard. I think that even when I disagree with some of these public philosophers, and I have disagreed with Derrida, and of course with Richard Rorty, who is, I think, to some extent a public philosopher, I think the public philosopher forces us to deepen our examination of the issues. I think today, especially in the age of the soundbite, in the age when tremendously powerful forces are trying to turn reasoning about public issues into a mockery, into simple manipulation by the media. The example of another kind of thinking, of serious reflective thinking, even which goes all the way to metaphysics, is terribly important. I think what you're doing in making these films, and what some foreign countries are doing in making this kind of program available even in the middle schools, in the high schools, is tremendously important in that direction. I think it would be good if we taught more philosophy in the high schools in this country, because I think part of the reason that philosophy has difficulty in having a public voice in the United States is that the subject is introduced too late. I was introduced to it in high school, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I think that was tremendously fortunate.